So this is going to be the review for December 12th, 2020, and I'm going to talk about Syria a little bit. And what some people might not know is that I've written almost as much about Syria and the ongoing war there as I have about Thailand, where I'm based. And the reason why that is because US regime change is a thing that is going on globally. They do it in countries all over the world, in every region. And if you can raise awareness and help create resistance to US regime change somewhere else, you're going to help impede it here as well. So raising awareness of what the US was doing in Syria is not only the right thing to do, but it's something that directly helps Thailand, because if the US is foiled in Syria, like it pretty much has been, it's going to have a much harder time of having success elsewhere, including Thailand. So what the US is doing in Syria is horrible. They've basically destroyed this country to the fullest extent that they could, and they still are. And this is an article from Foreign Policy, and it's recent, it's this month, it's not recent as in published today, but it's something that caught my eye when I was checking the headlines today. Assad's Syria is starting to starve like Saddam's Iraq. For the Western media, the last thing that they should be doing is reminding people what the US did to Iraq. Because what they did to Iraq was one of the worst crimes against humanity of the 21st century. The US sanctions leading up to the war, and then the lies about weapons of mass destruction, and then the invasion and ongoing occupation ever since has been one of the worst crimes against humanity of the 21st century. So when the US tries to posture and talk about human rights in places like Russia and China, neither of those countries or both of those countries combined, even the worst things that the US makes up about both of these countries combined, does not even come close to what the US openly did in front of the entire world to Iraq and now to Syria. So if you go through this article, they're basically just saying how US sanctions have targeted this country. They're blocking essentials from reaching the country. It's having a direct impact on the civilian population of the country. It's basically a 21st century version of a medieval siege. They've surrounded the country and they've cut almost everything off. And the only things that are getting in are like through, from Iran, maybe from Russia to a certain extent, and nothing else is getting in. And when they talk about, Western humanitarian organizations, they're sending stuff into places like Idlib, which are run by terrorists, backed by Turkey, a NATO member. And so you know, this is a huge problem. And by the way, most people in Syria live in government controlled areas. And that's not because the government forced them to, it's because they fled everywhere where the terrorists were to places where the government was. So we go through this article, and again, they're comparing it to what the US did to Iraq. And they even admit right here about 500,000 children were said to have died in Iraq as a result of US led sanctions. And, they try to remain as dictatorial as ever until he was ousted, only when the U.S. attacked with its military. And of course, the U.S. attacked with its military based on a deliberately falsified pretext of weapons of mass destruction being in Iraq. The entire thing was a fabrication. Iraq was not within the sphere of influence of the United States. The United States wanted it to be, and so they made up basically war propaganda, a war propaganda campaign against Iraq to justify the invasion and to pull Iraq into the U.S. sphere of influence. And it hasn't really worked out very well. And the war against Syria has worked out even worse for the United States. When Russia became involved in 2015, it basically ended any prospect of a U.S. military invasion. And the U.S. has been kind of confined to eastern Syria on the other side of the Euphrates River. And they have a very tenuous grip even on that. And the vector sum of what's happening in the Middle East is, despite all the sanctions on Iran and Syria and the US still being in Iraq, they're slowly getting pushed out of the region. And countries like Russia are starting to kind of entrench themselves there, especially in Syria. And if we go down here, I do believe that they mention, let's take a look, because I did read this before I started the video. The aim of this year's Caesar sanctions, named after the police defector who fled Syria, with the evidence of the killing of thousands of Syrians in state-run prisons. So Caesar is to Syria what Curveball was to Iraq. He's possibly a defector or whatever he is. He's just this propaganda tool that the US had that no one even knows what his real name is. The evidence that he produced, if you actually look at it, is inconsequential. It's not anything that can be verified. When you look at Caesar's, he had all these photos of people he claimed were killed by the Syrian government. There's no evidence of that. The FBI said, oh, well, we confirmed that those are authentic photos. When you actually look at what the FBI confirmed, all they confirmed was that the photos weren't doctored, that they weren't fake photos. They did nothing to figure out who these people were, how they died, who took the pictures, nothing like that. So it's basically war propaganda, which is all the US does. This isn't going to be the first time the US is actually being honest about what's happening in one of these countries where it also just so happens to openly want to affect regime change. So that's what this foreign policy article is. It's basically, it's kind of a bizarre admission to a repeat of what's going on in Iraq. And there's also mention of Henrik Boll Foundation, who's saying that, oh, we should be putting sanctions on Assad, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his inner circle, but we shouldn't be doing it in a way that hurts Syrian civilians. But of course, that's Henrik Boll pretending to care. In reality, why are you putting sanctions on the president of Syria? What did he do that was wrong? He's protecting his country from what is now a verified foreign-funded, foreign-armed proxy invasion of his country. That is his duty. It's his responsibility to protect his country, just like it's the responsibility of any other country's government to protect against foreign invasion. These terrorists were literally crossing the border from Turkey into Syria and from Jordan into southern Syria. This is all fact. This is all confirmed. Even newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post eventually admitted that the US was flying in plane loads of weapons into Turkey and into Jordan and handing it to these militants and terrorists and sending them over the border, giving them fleets of brand new Toyota pickup trucks. We all seen the photos of like ISIS tooling around in these they're called technicals. When you take the pickup truck and you convert it into a weapons platform, it's called a technical. And we've seen fleets of these of identical brand new Toyota trucks, and we're like, where did ISIS get that? The US admits that it was sending fleets of Toyota trucks, and they're just like, oh, it's accidentally got into ISIS's hands. No, it didn't. This was all by plan. And we know this for a fact, and this is how I'm gonna end this. I'm gonna put the link to this foreign policy article and a couple of my own articles exposing what's been going on in Syria, including the Toyota truck story. But I'm going to conclude on this. We know what was going on in Syria. We know the US and its Western allies were arming and funding the worst of the terrorist groups in Syria, because as soon as Russia entered the conflict in 2015, they began bombing the supply lines running from Turkey into Syria. And as soon as they started doing that, the fighting capacity of al-Qaeda affiliates like Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State itself, their fighting capacity collapsed all over the country as soon as those supply lines started being bombed by Russian warplanes. And this was why Turkey was trying to target those warplanes, even managed to shoot at least one down. And there was some very high tension there, because at that point, once those supply lines were cut, because this was never an internal civil war, this was always an external conflict being fueled by the US. And all of the supplies, all the weapons, all the fighters were coming into the country. And as soon as Syria with their Russian allies were able to cut those supply lines, it was essentially over. So that's why you saw, Syria and Turkey and Russia and even the United States so close to the brink of war with each other there, because Washington and their allies, they knew that that was the end. They knew that was the end of their proxy war, and that from there on, it was going to just be spoiling, doing everything they could to spoil reconstruction and the return to normal in Syria, which is what these sanctions are part of. And this is something that Syria and its allies are going to have to work hard to work around in order to rebuild the country. So again, just another absolute unforgivable crime against humanity. This is the United States government doing this. They did it from the Obama-Biden administration to the Trump-Pence administration, and it will continue under the Biden-Harris administration. And the U.S. government doing this is the same U.S. government that the protesters here in Thailand are taking money from and begging help from to do regime change here in Thailand. So keep that in mind. You can tell a lot about somebody by who their friends are, and the fact that the Thai protesters, the anti-government protesters here in Thailand, their friends are the worst war criminals on earth today. Just tells you everything you need to know. So for my patrons who make these videos possible, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And if you're watching this video when I post it publicly, please like and share it. Check the video description for links and also ways you can help support my work, including my Patreon account. That way, you're not only supporting my work monthly, but you also get benefits and extra content in return. And as always, thank you very much for watching.